Hello, everyone, and welcome to our webinar today on Regional Cumulative Effects Assessment and Management for Mining Transitions. Your host today is the International Association for Impact Assessment, or IAIA. We are the leading global network on best practice for using impact assessment to make informed decisions. My name is Bridget John. Don't worry, you won't be seeing too much of me. Just a little bit at the beginning and at the end, but I will be just starting you off here. You can see on the screen there that if our handle for at IAI Network and our hashtag IAIA webinar. If you see or hear anything on today's webinar that you would like to share on social media, please feel free to do so. And if you're an IAI member, don't forget about the IAI Hub, our online professional community. You can share things there as well. I did want to give you just a little bit of information about IAIA before we get started into the meat of the webinar. You can see some of our resources and training on the screen there. We have several webinars on demand. We record all of our webinars, including the one today, and they are available on demand for you to watch at your leisure. The two that are listed on the screen happen to be about digital impact assessment, but we have a variety of topics on biodiversity, health, resettlement, data protection. So please visit our website and check out all the topics available there. Our major upcoming event is our annual conference. This year it will be held at the end of May in Quebec City, Canada. The topic is misinformation, disinformation, communication, and impact assessment. It's a mouthful, but incredibly timely. And so registration is open through early May, and we hope that you will consider joining us there. We also have some online training courses. These are virtual training courses with live trainers and live classmates. There's 3 of them coming up: Leadership in ESIA in March, Public Participation in April, and Involuntary Resettlement, Planning, Livelihood Restoration, and SIA at the end of April, early May. So registration is open for those online as well. We've recently launched some on-demand training. Now this is at your own pace and asynchronous, completely on-demand, short, 60 to 90 minutes max, and it's based on our recently launched SEA guidance for the renewable energy sector. There's a Foundations of SEA course, one for decision makers, and then there are some for the various different renewable energy sectors. Right now we have wind, solar, hydropower, and bioenergy, with more subsectors to come. Our professional development program is a little bit more in depth than those training that I've mentioned so far. It's a 12-week program, and we have 2 different courses, Foundations in Impact Assessment and Social Impact Assessment. As I said, they're 12 weeks, but the really neat part about it is that you're paired with one-on-one with a mentor, with a trainer. And so you can dive a little bit deeper and go into things that are really specific to your situation and talk to your trainer about that. So our next courses start for that in June, and registration is open. If you have visited our website before, but not recently, I do invite you to check it out, because we have revamped it recently, and that includes something I'm really excited about, which is our new resource library. And there you will find a wealth of publications, ones we've had and new ones all the time. But the neat part about it is it's got even better filtering capabilities and grouping capabilities based on the types of publications you want. And so it's much easier to find what you're looking for. So whether you're looking for some short, fast information like our 2-page fast tips, or something a little bit more in depth like our best practice principles or some guidance documents, you can find them in our resource library. So please visit www.iaia.org and check out all that IAI has to offer in terms of training and resources. Now, before we get into the real reason you're all here today, which is the webinar and our panelists and presenters, let me just give you a quick little tour of GoToWebinar and get some housekeeping out of the way. As I said, we are recording this session, and you will receive in a day or two a link to the recording. At the top of GoToWebinar, you'll see a panel. There's the chat button there, and that's where you'll see some announcements. I will post a link to part 2 of this webinar once we get started. The questions tab has the question mark there, and that's where you can post questions for our panelists and presenters. And don't feel that you have to wait till the very end to post those questions. Post them at any time. We will be monitoring those in the back end. The icon with the paperclip, that's where you can download the slides for today's presentation. And if you have any issues with settings or audio, click that little gear icon and you will find it there. Well, now with all of that out of the way, I'm really excited to be able to move into our webinar, which is, as I said, Regional Cumulative Effects Assessment and Management, or RCEAM, for mining transitions. And as I said, this is part 1 of 2. The second one will be on February 19th. I'll post the link in a little bit so that you can get registered. Well, Regional Cumulative Effects Assessment and Management to support transitions in mining economies is a project that aims to develop a systematic method for assessing cumulative social, cultural, economic, and environmental impacts at a regional scale. The project is in the second of 3 stages, and it is further supporting the development of capability, tools, and resources to enable use of RCEAM as part of regional planning and decision making for regions in transition. There is a lot more to say on this topic, and so I'm going to start introducing our facilitators and presenters. Will Rifkin, you will see him later. He is going to be speaking in part 2, but you will see him. He's managing all of the Q&A and taking a look at your questions on the back end. Our presenters today are Jenny Pope, Raquel Tardin Coelho, and Jessica Reeves. And Monica will be running the slides on the back end. Thank you, Monica, for doing that very important job. She will be speaking in the part 2 of this webinar as well. Each one of these presenters will be introducing themselves a little bit as they get started. And so, as I said, there's so much more to say about this topic. So without further ado or delay, I want to turn this over to Jenny, our first speaker.
Thanks very much, Bridget, for the introductions. My name's Jenny Pope. I'm a long-term IAIA member and a researcher and consultant in Western Australia. I'll be speaking first today, followed by Raquel and then Jess. And we've got some bios on the slide, and I understand those slides will be made available so you can read a bit more about us. There are 3 speakers for today. I'd like to start by acknowledging country. We acknowledge traditional custodians throughout Australia and their continuing connections to their lands, waters and communities. We pay our respects to all First Nations peoples and communities and to elders past and present. And I'm speaking today from Wajak Noongar Budja. So today in part 1 of this 2-part webinar, we're going to run through a very brief introduction to the organisation under whose auspices this research was conducted, which is IAIA, and a little bit about the project. I'll then go through what was stage 1 of the research, which was about case study analysis and developing a typology of RCEAM. Raquel will speak about Indigenous involvement in RCEAM before she goes on to give an overview of some other aspects of the study, and we move into Q&A. So CRC Time is a cooperative research centre, which means it's a collaboration between the Australian government, research institutions and industry. And the name of this particular one is CRC Time, so that stands for Transformations in Mining Economy. And it's probably about halfway through its 10-year funding period. And CRC Time runs a lot of different research projects. It has the vision that post-mine transitions are valued and enabled to create enduring benefit for all Australians. And its mission is bringing together diverse stakeholders to help reimagine and transform mine closure and post-mine transitions. When it first started, there were 8 research priority areas identified, and you can see there that priority 7 was assessing and predicting cumulative impact, and that's really the basis for the research that we've been conducting over the past few years. It was recognised very early on that mining leaves cumulative impact legacies, but there are also opportunities, cumulative and collaborative opportunities as communities and regions transition away from mining towards other economic bases. So it was seen from the beginning that there's an opportunity and increasingly an expectation for mining companies, regulators and other regional stakeholders to proactively shape transitions in mining regions, as well as managing legacy issues resulting from mining by understanding how impacts and benefits accumulate and interact at a regional scale. So the focus of this research has really been on how regional cumulative effects assessment and management can inform mine closure and transitions, but through the process it's been recognised that the thinking and the methodologies that we're talking about can also inform decision making throughout the life of mine. As Bridget mentioned, the project has been conducted in 3 stages. I was involved in stage 1, so that's what I'm going to be talking about, and that was undertaking the case study analysis and developing a typology. Stage 2, recently completed, has been about developing capacity, and that's what Raquel and the rest of my colleagues will be speaking about. We're hoping that it will move into stage 3, whereby we will run some pilot studies on regional cumulative effects assessment and management for mine closure. So moving into my part of the content, which is the case study analysis. This research was conducted a couple of years ago, and it was building on some foundational research that had been done very early in CRC Time's life, which did a bit of an exploration about what the potential for RCEAM to be applied in a mine closure context. What came out of that were there are a lot of barriers. Everybody agreed it was a great idea, but in terms of actually getting it done, a lot of barriers were identified. And I guess one of the really big barriers was that nobody really had a very clear understanding of what RCEAM could be, what it actually looked like. And so this first part of the research was looking at what was already being done. And so initially, one of the first objective was to analyse selected Australian and Canadian case studies, recognising that much good work has been done in Canada, looking at their success factors, challenges and lessons learnt to generate insights on how you might do this, including addressing some of the challenge areas like how to define regions, what the governance arrangements should be, Indigenous involvement, etc., etc. The second objective was to scan this practice and to develop a typology of practice, distinguishing what scope the process might have, who might initiate it, conduct it or implement it, and primarily why it would be conducted, like what are the objectives, and given those objectives, what outputs does it need to deliver in order to achieve its purpose. And then we moved on to taking that knowledge gained through that process to really think about what that could possibly mean for mining transitions. So the first step of this research was desktop case study analysis and developing a draft typology. I reviewed 10 case studies in Canada and 9 in Australia as the basis for that. What became really clear was that almost none of these case studies had anything to do with mine closure at all. Often these sorts of studies, these large-scale regional cumulative effects studies, are conducted in advance of development to help shape the trajectory of development more than to close development down. But we felt that there was still a lot to be learned from these case studies. The second stage was a detailed data collection analysis stage through which the typology was revised, and I was lucky enough to conduct a research trip to Canada in May and June of 2023, interviewed 30 people in 9 cities, including researchers, experts, government representatives, First Nations, academics, NGOs. And I also attended the Indigenous Centre for Cumulative Effects conference that year. Was one of the really eye-opening things for me personally coming from Australia was just how advanced and how amazing the work being done by First Nations and other Indigenous groups in Canada on cumulative effects was. Also conducted other interviews in person and online from Australia. So in total, there were 38 interviews with 39 people. Out of that came this typology, which I'm going to talk through in a little bit more detail in each category. But primarily, it's categorised in there was a huge range of variation of RCEAM processes. Some of them were standalone studies that were called regional cumulative effects assessment, and in other cases, they were part of a bigger planning process or a subset of something else. So the typology is divided into why, then the purpose and the outputs, the who initiates, who coordinates, the what type of process it is, and what the scope is. So if we go through each of these one by one, one of the things that really stuck with me was this quote from one of my interviews, was that it's essential to start with a really clear understanding of what what the purpose of this study is. These are potentially really time-consuming and resource-intensive processes. So what are we trying to provide information for, and who's going to do what with that information? So some of the purposes that we identified were to inform future planning and decision making, whereby the outputs might be a look at the current conditions within a region, the trends and the cumulative pathways operating. It might be to identify a preferred future scenario. You might do scenario analysis to look at the cumulative impacts under different scenarios. You might want to evaluate the acceptability of cumulative effects that have already happened or that will happen under a business as usual scenario. You might want to identify knowledge gaps to inform future research. And you might also want to support the ongoing monitoring and management of cumulative effects. And in that case, the product of the RCEAM might be management objectives or triggers, for example, or monitoring data and recommendations. What was interesting was that of the case studies we looked at, they all had quite different purposes. And I found it useful. There's some great work by Jill Blakely, who looks at the 4 broad steps of cumulative effects assessment, being scoping, retrospective analysis, prospective analysis and decision making. And we could see that different case studies really focused on particular steps. So not all processes have all 4 steps. You can stop at 2 if that's the purpose. So an example of that was the Manitoba Hydro Regional Cumulative Effect Assessment, and also one from Australia where our pressure state response study was done on a marine area called Coburn Sound. In terms of looking ahead and trying to use RCEAM to plan future development, a couple of case studies there were the Great Sandhills Regional Environmental Study and the Wood Buffalo National Park Strategic Environmental Assessment, also the Great Barrier Reef Strategic Assessment in Australia. And several were really focused not so much on the prediction, but on ongoing management. So one of those examples was the Metlakatla First Nations Cumulative Effects Management Framework, and also a project called Boomtown Indicators, which looks at the cumulative social indicators of coal and coal seam gas development in Australia. In terms of who initiates and who coordinates, that was also interesting. Several of the case studies were initiated and coordinated by government, but at the request of a third party. 2 of them were World Heritage Sites, the Wood Buffalo National Park and the Great Barrier Reef. And in those cases, the World Heritage Committee of UNESCO actually requested the Canadian and Australian governments respectively conduct those cumulative impact studies. There's a forthcoming assessment in Canada, the Slave Geological Province Regional SEA, which was requested by a First Nation. In some cases, these processes might also be initiated by industry at the request of government, such as the Elk Valley Cumulative Effects Assessment and Management, a process that was ultimately then taken over by government but was started by a coal mining company. Research institutions have a role to play. Simon Fraser University has been working with the Metlakatla, University of Queensland with the Boomtown Indicators, and Simon Fraser again with the Alberta Foothills study. Communities, including Indigenous nations, can both initiate and coordinate and do. And there's a question mark over whether all stakeholders are invited to participate by the coordinator, or is it selective? And we also found a bit of a range on that front as well. Then what type of process is it? We found that most of the case studies we looked at didn't have a regulatory backing. They weren't done as part of a regulatory process. A couple that were the Great Barrier Reef Strategic Assessment, which was conducted under Australia's Commonwealth Environment Protection and Biodiversity Conservation Act. And of course, you have regional assessments under the Impact Assessment Act in Canada. And so there's some things coming through now. But most of the case studies were non-regulatory. Even if government was involved, they weren't actually conducted under the auspices of an act. And there are pros and cons of both of those approaches. Most of the case studies we looked at were one-off studies, but some of them were ongoing, particularly the ones that are focused on monitoring and management, such as Metlakatla and the Boomtown Indicators. So again, whether it's an ongoing thing or a one-off thing really depends on what the purpose of the exercise is. In terms of the scope, some of the studies take an integrated social, economic, cultural, environmental focus. Particularly the Indigenous-led ones are very inherently integrated, but some really look at a single category. So, for example, there was a regional cumulative impact assessment being conducted in the mining town of Karratha in Western Australia, which was really looking at the social impacts of mining development. Pressures can also be, it's also maybe useful to look at all pressures, all other development, all pressures such as climate change, or it might be important to look at a single type of development because maybe that's what you've got control over to manage. And an example of that is Transport Canada's Cumulative Effects Assessment of Marine Shipping. So there may be good reasons to limit the scope and not be broad, and again it depends on what the purpose of the study really is. So some conclusions that we drew about RCEAM in general is that it can take many forms, and really each process should be bespoke, and that includes defining the region. What the region is will depend on the circumstances of that region. The process can be extremely resource intensive. Therefore, it's essential to be clear about the purpose and to tailor accordingly. Unfortunately, there are some stories about very, very detailed scientific studies being done, but they're not really going anywhere, not really going to influence decision making. So the question should always be who will do what with the outcomes. Different governance models are possible. Ideally, government would lead, but there are pros and cons of processes being undertaken under regulatory frameworks. But the really important thing is that implementation pathways, who is exactly going to do what, who's going to be responsible, need to be clearly defined. A very broad range of possible tools and methods can be utilised, ranging from highly qualitative to highly quantitative. And Monica will be speaking about that in the second part of the webinar next week. And one of the messages that I took back was that Canada is seeing a rapidly growing body of practice in Indigenous-led RCEAM and other forms of impact assessment, both for territorial management processes and also as a basis for engaging with government and project proponents. And Raquel will be talking about what that might look like in an Australian context very shortly. Moving on to what this means for mining transitions, I think it's fair to say that mine closure is a novel application of RCEAM. We didn't find case studies where this was already being done because RCEAM is typically applied to new developments. One area where Jess lives and works is the Latrobe Valley, where 3 coal mines and associated power infrastructure are being closed. And that case study really highlights the complexity of closure. And we looked at that from an RCEAM perspective and realised just how many moving parts there really were. So it's very, very complex. Very importantly, commercial entities such as mining companies really need a value proposition to participate in these processes. In Australia, we definitely don't have any kind of regulatory stick that's going to force companies to do this, so there needs to be a reason why they would want to do it. And that really comes down to social licence to operate and demonstration of ESG risk management being key drivers. Some of the barriers that come up may include a lack of trust in other participants. So if I do this, how can I trust that you're going to do that? And unwillingness to share data is a big one as well. I think initially there was a hope that these sorts of processes would be able to apportion responsibility for legacy cumulative effects and say, mine A is responsible for this amount of groundwater contamination, this mine B is responsible for this. I don't think that's feasible at all. I think it really needs to be looked at as a collective and collaborative mechanism and a cost-effective response to cumulative effects. It's been said that cumulative effects require cumulative solutions, and I think that really is the best way to look at it. And from a mining company perspective, sharing responsibility also means sharing regulatory risk. So why RCEAM for mine closure? I think that if you think through some of the typical questions that RCEAM can answer, like where are we now, where are we heading, how do we get here, where should we go, what needs to be protected, what needs to be monitored and managed, I think all of those things translate into a mine closure and transition context. So we might ask, what are the legacy impacts of concern? What issues, typically environmental issues, have been accumulating over time, over the life of mine? What are the potential socioeconomic impacts and opportunities of the transition? Obviously, there are social impacts when mine closes, but where are the opportunities to transition to a sustainable future? What levers are available to manage impacts and realise opportunities? What are the implications of alternative potential post-mining land uses and economic activity? What needs to be protected from further harm? What needs to be monitored and managed? So I think there's a really good translation between what RCEAM can do and the issues that mine closure and transition face. So just some of the possibilities, some potential applications might be to assess the cumulative impacts of using water to fill pit voids of multiple mines, as is happening in the Latrobe Valley, to inform the evaluation of alternative post-mining land uses, to inform spatial planning for infrastructure development post-mining, for example, when renewable energy projects might come into a region that had previously been a mining region, by assessing cumulative environmental and social effects of alternative locations. To inform transitional planning by assessing the interrelated social and economic cumulative effects of closure on regional communities. To support visioning and planning for community socio-economic development post-mining. In an Australian context, to support caring for country activities by traditional owners post-mining, and to develop monitoring and management programs for legacy effects. So that was a very quick run through the outcomes of the stage 1 of this research, with thanks to many stage 1 project partners. I'd now like to hand over to Raquel to speak about Indigenous involvement in RCEAM.
First of all, I'd like to thank you for the opportunity to be here today. Introducing myself a little bit, I work with Curtin Institute, mainly on cultural landscapes, regional planning, and landscape planning. Before we start, I would like to pay my respects to all First Nations peoples and to elders, past, present, and emerging, specifically from the Wajik and the Puntu Kuntik Brahma and Pinikura peoples, here from Western Australia, the traditional custodians of the land where this research was developed. Monica? Indigenous involvement in RCEAM is the work package 2. Sorry, can you go back? Yes. Indigenous involvement in RCEAM is the work package 2 of a broader project that is a systematic approach to regional cumulative effects assessment and management to support transitions in mining and community stage 2, which Jenny has introduced it. The next one. Before we start here, and Jenny has talked a little bit about it, but in the context of Indigenous involvement, what is regional cumulative effects assessment and management? So considering that RCEAM is the assessment of the combined effects of multiple development stresses at a regional scale, we can see this as well, and the assessment of those effects over time. And what would be the Indigenous involvement in this process? From our perspective in this research, that is not about consultation, and it's not about integrating Indigenous values or assimilating Indigenous values into Western science frameworks. For us here, Indigenous involvement in RCEAM, it's about shared authority, and it's about creating a shared space where Indigenous and non-Indigenous assessments equally interact. It means that methodologically, how can we propose an IRC, as we are calling it, where methods and tools and perspectives from Indigenous communities lead the process and how they can interact with Western science perspective, but in a parallel way. And then how can we create this shared space? To do this, we did an extensive literature review based on mainly on case from Canada and Norway. And also we honored with one community with 2 language groups, the PKKP, and we did also some interviews with non-Indigenous people from government, from industry, from research agencies, and NGOs. Next one. What are the effects of development on Indigenous lands? I brought here some maps. One, it's about the location of mining developments in Australia. The other one is the native title map of Australia. Native title concedes some rights to Indigenous communities, rights in relation to their land and the practice of their culture mainly. And in the pictures at the bottom, they show what really means on the ground a mining development. It's mainly a big hole. And when it happens, the effects are huge in relation to the disruption of environmental, social, cultural, and economic systems. On the other hand, we have the songline maps of Indigenous Australians, and it means here a perspective, how the Indigenous communities, they see their land, the connection with their land, how they live their culture, and how their culture means everything for them. And through this relational perspective, when it comes to the effects of mining, what does it mean? And how through they can exercise their perspective in relation to decision-making and authority to influence those effects to become more positive for them and for all in relation to sustainability. How applying this, how in the understanding the whole process of RCEAM through an Indigenous lens can benefit everybody in relation to sustainability. So what we realize is that a systemic and holistic methodological approach to cumulative effects assessment and management, encompassing the social, cultural, ecological system in a comprehensive way, aligned with economic consideration, was still missing. Monica, the next one. And why is this significant? Why, by doing this, we can have those benefits that we are expecting? There is a policy and political context in relation to Indigenous rights and the exercise of those rights. There is an interest in achieving sustainable development goals. Also, here in Australia, the closing the gaps targets, mostly in relation to community development, according to community-defined well-being, it's really important as well, as a government policy, and nature positive requirements with quantitative and qualitative goals that consider the cultural landscape as the leading of it. Then without it, it doesn't make sense in the sense of it's not a quantitative reasoning, but also a place-based one with real process on the ground. Another point is about corporate outcomes that can come up from developing and implementing this RCEAM. It comes to have the possibility of acquiring an ongoing social license to operate based on social and cultural values, enhancing the environmental, social, and governance of companies, corporate social environmental responsibility attached to it, and his risk mitigation and cost management for an operation, and also regulatory compliance. Another point and important as well, it's about our economic outcomes, mainly for communities in relation to carbon participation in carbon biodiversity market, creation of local jobs and local businesses. The next one, Monica. And how can we do this? How can we build this framework? The first thing is we need some principles. By developing those principles, we came with some important outcomes. One thing, it's about the importance of co-leadership with Indigenous communities, and it comes with participation in decision-making. From the Canadian examples, we have some models. One is the co-developed one, co-developed with industry, the co-managed one developed with state, and the independent one, where the community, each community can do their own RCEAM. And of course, it's possible. It's more expensive, but it's possible. But what came up from the Canadian examples is that the co-leadership and the co-developed model, it's more possible in relation to capacity, financial, and mainly capacity and financial responsibilities and possibilities. Another principle that is really important is about Indigenous people's rights, relationships, processes, and outcomes leading the whole process of IAIA. This picture here shows this and the importance of each of those, the rights as the roots, the base of everything, relationships as the interface, and the importance of understanding relationship and values since the beginning and even before, to set processes and outcomes according to those Indigenous communities, or involving those Indigenous communities. Because another point that it's important is when we thought of this IAIA, it's about having one process that is only based on the indigenous land, it is only based on the leadership of the indigenous communities. Another one that it's about Western science that Monica will develop it a little bit more in the part 2. And then how can we put it together? How can those assessment and management can be negotiated? How can we create a space for dialogue to have this other space, this shared space where we come with the final RCEAM? Another point important, it's about being values driven. The values must be set by the communities, and place-based assessments as well. Each community has their own cultural protocols and culture. Another point is about how can we be systemic and holistic? How can we understand the process not by dimensions, environmental dimensions, social dimension, etc., but how those dimensions can be related through relational objectives. This is another point. How they affect each other. The other principle is about knowledge integration, and knowledge integration this way that I told you, how can they can come together respectfully? How can Western science support the indigenous perspective, and how they can, both assessment can define final decisions. And another point is about adaptive management, because the landscape changes, values change, and people change as well. How can this management can be ongoing in relation to mining development? And another point is, we are talking here about mining development, but when we talk about effects, we must consider all the effects of mining, effect of urbanization, effects of agriculture. So here, mining would be one point in this whole effects assessment. The other one, Monica? By thinking of those principles, the next step was, okay, how can we operationalize it? So we came with this IAIA framework. The framework is based on the principles and set by the values, and all the stages, they are in between principles and values. So those are the boundaries about the 5 stages. One is the initiation phase, scoping phase, retrospective assessment, prospective assessment, and decision-making and implementation that would be developed in the shared space. The initiation phase, it's about setting the foundations, the values, the expectations, time, resources, and developing a database. It's the preparation of everything and understanding relationships, mainly in this stage. The scoping phase, it's about values and selection of those values and value components, relational objectives and outcomes, understanding those relationships, indicators setting, indicators, triggers, and thresholds, spatial and temporal boundaries according to an indigenous perspective, stressors and direct and indirect effects, how they interact with the dimensions, environment, social, cultural, and economic, the significance of everything set by the indigenous communities, and the baselines consider the transformation of the landscape over time, and what would be the excellent baseline set by the indigenous communities as well. The retrospective assessment, past pressures, and how to understand the landscape nowadays, why is this way. Prospective assessment, when we have the prediction of future effects, mitigation and improvement, strategies to deal with it, and scenario analysis. When it comes to decision-making and implementation, so this would be the IAIA. When it comes to decision-making and implementation, how this assessment through an indigenous lenses can interact with the Western science assessment, and how can we set the governance for this? The next one, Monica. Each stage is based on overarching scoping criteria. So we have 4 criteria mainly. The conservation, that will base, the relational objectives would be based on this. What would be the conservation or restoration of the integrity of the social, cultural, ecological systems according to the communities, systemic consideration of landscape scales, local and regional, understanding that the effects, they are not only at a regional scale, they start on a local scale. So how those scales, they are related to themselves, and what we need to pay attention to at a regional scale or at a local scale, knowledge integration and how this integration happens, and contribution to sustainability. When it comes to decision-making and implementation, collaboration is essential. So paying attention to indigenous governance and having decision-making strategies set together with the communities, it means that each community has its governance, how the communities, they can align themselves in a region, and how this alignment can be aligned with proponents in this case, when we are evaluating one project into this whole scenario, the cumulative effects assessment and management. So how can we understand it first? And has the potential for collaborative governance, how to set some tools, some mechanisms of collaborative governance at this regional scale, understanding and incorporating the indigenous governance, and understanding and incorporate the Western governance, Western science, and the companies as well, the governance. And management, how can we manage it? How can we manage the effects over time in an ongoing basis, set by, agreed by both people, both parties involved in this. The other one. After we finished the literature review, we thought that, is it possible? Is it desired as well? What people see in relation to developing an RCEAM here in Australia, and what would be the positive and negative effects? What would be the barriers and opportunities to implement it here? So despite we reaching out to many communities, just one community with 2 language groups could participate in this, and was crucial and really relevant, and it was PKKP. So we started asking what would be the negative cumulative effects of mining, and what would be the positive cumulative effects of mining. And the negative cumulative effects that came out were the climate change first, the contribution to climate change, the negative contribution to climate change, destruction of culturally significant sites, landform alterations, removal of trees and other vegetation, and the death of animals, noise disturbances and dust production, pollution of air, soil, surface water, and groundwater, and lack of access to country. And the positive cumulative effects or the economic opportunities and institutional strengthening. How to deal, and another point is how to deal with those negative cumulative effects, meaning and how to give strength to the positive cumulative effects. The next one. The barriers and opportunities that we found in relation, listening to PKKP and listening to non-Indigenous parties, in relation to the barriers specifically, listening to PKKP, they came out with mining closure plans and management. It's a problem, it's a challenge, because they start too late in the process and the development of an operation. Poor engagement, that it's only when it's needed. The consultation is done only when it's needed. There is no ongoing consultation or participation. Western scientific significance to what is their values. No data sharing, inadequate legislation, and non-inclusive decision-making processes. And what came up from non-Indigenous parties was post-mine closure challenges, the same. Poor engagement, the same. No data sharing, outdated legislation and institutional silos, non-inclusive decision-making processes, lack of government capacity, and time and budget constraints. So what we see here is the barriers, they align. And interestingly, they align between the Indigenous and non-Indigenous parties, and they align with what came up from the literature review as well. So what we concluded here is there is a pathway to work on, like what those barriers are important, and we need to provide some, to consider that further on in our research. The other slide. In relation to the opportunities, again, the perspectives, they align. So for PKKP, early engagement and partnerships would transform the relationship between the community and the proponents, and facilitate the process a lot. And it means respect, it means responsibility and reciprocity. Capacity building inside the communities, and capacity building inside companies as well, and also government in relation to the cultural aspects of it. Co-leadership in mine closure planning, doing it together. Here we are not using the word co-design, but co-leadership, really doing things together through this process that I mentioned to you before. Co-leadership in mine development management, an ongoing one, I mean, deciding what to do together. Regional agreements with other indigenous groups. So it's not about dealing with one indigenous group, but how can we do this in how it can be done at a regional scale. From the non-indigenous parties, what came up is that early engagement, relationship building, it's fundamental again. So capacity building again, both in both sides, both parties, no, if you can say it this way. Indigenous knowledge and co-leadership, it's really important to be included in the process. Mandatory regulation and guidance in relation to RCEAM. Regional collaboration and strategy, so everybody together, really, through a clear process, a roadmap, and risk management. So as an opportunity, the companies, they say that, the companies, government, researchers, they say that risk management, it can facilitate risk management. So the main takeaways in relation to RCEAM is that it's really co-labor action at a regional scale, considering the differences at the local scale, restoring and sustaining landscapes from an indigenous perspective, ensuring cultural, social, and ecological values are respected, protected, and aligned with meaningful economic values, promoting self-determination and long-term community well-being, enabling comprehensive regional landscape planning and management, and leading to transformative actions towards sustainability goals for everybody. The next one. Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Raquel, and thank you, Jenny. I'm Jess Reeves, and I'm just going to speak for a very short while to be a bridge between this week's presentation and next week's presentation, so I hope you'll be able to join us again. As Jenny mentioned, I'm a researcher, sustainability scientist based at Federation University in the Latrobe Valley in Australia, where we are seeing closure of our brown coal mines and significant energy transition from brown coal energy generation to a range of different renewable energy. So all of this work is incredibly relevant to where I live as well as where I work. Next slide, please, Monica. I'd like to acknowledge that I'm coming from the lands of the Gunai-Kurnai people today, and I'd like to pay my respects to their elders, past, present, and emerging. Now, in terms of the project, as you've heard from Jenny, and just putting that into a little bit of context, there was the foundation project run by Renee Young, then stage 1 that Jenny spoke to, and one of the components you've just heard about from stage 2, which is the RCEAM framework that Raquel has just presented on. And if you're able to join us next week, you'll hear more about the roadmap and toolkit from Monica, the governance models from Will, and the readiness assessment from myself. We're hoping to complete stage 2 by the middle of this year, and then moving on to stage 3, which will be really implementing a pilot project, most likely in the Pilbara in Western Australia. I'd also just like to acknowledge Darren Murphy, who was leading stage 2 of this project, and the work that he's done to get us to this stage. Next slide, please, Monica. And again, we've had a very broad range of partners who have been involved in the project thus far, and we'll see it through to the next stage. So we'd like to acknowledge their continuing support. And just the last slide for now, please. We do have a lot of resources available, which I believe will be sent out to you in links as well, but you're welcome to take a screenshot and use the QR codes, which has the lists to all of the reports that have been published through this stage. And also I see that Bridget has put a link in the chat about registering for our seminar next week, but you can also do so through this QR code here. So I know you've got a few of you got questions already, and some of you sent through questions in the registration. So I'd like to make sure we've got time available for that. So I will say thank you, see you next week, and hand over to Will, who will moderate the questions. Thank you. Thank you all.
Hi, I'm Will Rifkin from the University of Newcastle, speaking to you from Sydney, Australia. I've been monitoring the questions on the GoToWebinar platform, and there have only been a couple. One was addressed, both have been addressed already. Brief overview of the questions you sent when you registered, and I welcome the panelists to respond to any of these if they have comments. If not, we may be able to get you out of here by the end of the hour. Your questions and comments fell into 4 different categories. One, the various settings you're dealing with, things like surface waters, rivers, groundwater, pollution in water, air pollution, ocean settings, biodiversity issues, climate issues, mine closure, energy transition, oil and gas, renewables, tourism, road construction, quarries, deep sea mining, combinations of development such as mining and agriculture, and artisanal mining. One of the key things you're worried about was setting boundaries for the regional assessment and what happens when that area crosses national boundaries. So that was settings. Another one was engagement, involvement and engagement of communities, issues of consultation fatigue, a fair number of comments about Indigenous and First Nations people, their lands, their sources of knowledge, their rights, their perceptions, the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, and national capacity to comply, and long-term cultural effects. Third category was governance. How do you start regional cumulative effects assessment and management? We'll get into that next week. The role for health agencies, psychosocial impacts, prevention, management, allocation of responsibility, enforcement. What do you do with weak governance and competing projects? How do you make a case to do RCEAM when it's heard to be needed? And how do you retain skilled labor in the region? And finally, you had questions about methods, which we'll get into a little bit today, which we got into a little today, and we'll get into more next week. Data sources, data presentation, transparency, triggers, thresholds, tools, AI tools, case examples, leading practices, bad examples, practical approaches, and how do you incorporate the mitigation hierarchy, address remediation, rehabilitation, involving multiple parties, coordination, and collaboration. So with that, I will get back to Bridget to close for IAIA.
Thank you so much, Will, and to all of the presenters today. It was a fantastic session, and I hope you are all excited to register for session number 2 on February 19th. As noted, the link is in the chat, but you can also find it on our website under training and then the webinars link. When you leave here today, you will receive a survey, and we do encourage you to complete that. It helps us have some feedback, but it also gives you an opportunity to provide topics that you would like to see future webinars on. We do take a look at those, and we would love to be able to bring to you topics of interest to you. So please share things that you want to know more about, and so we can get that information out to you in a future webinar. As you see on the screen there, if you see our social handle and hashtag. So again, if there was something that you really wanted to share on social media, please do so, or members, you can post in the hub. We know that your time was valuable, so we hope you found this to be valuable as well. So we will see you next time.